Imagine your mortgage, your student loans, all your credit card bills, just gone. Wiped clean by a single government decree. It sounds like a modern fantasy, a radical idea that would never fly. But what if I told you that 5,000 years ago, this was not a fantasy at all? It was state policy. In the very civilization that invented writing, the wheel. In the city, rulers regularly hit a giant, societal reset button, forgiving the debts of their people. But this was not some grand act of kindness. It was a brutally effective and deeply cynical tool of control. They built a system designed to trap you, and then they made themselves heroes by setting you free. This is the story of how ancient Mesopotamia weaponized finance. When we picture ancient Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, we think of ziggurats piercing the sky, the birth of cities like Ur and Babylon, and the first scribbles of language on clay tablets. It is the cradle of civilization, where so much of our world began. But under the surface of these amazing achievements lies another, more unsettling invention: the systematic use of interest-bearing debt as a form of social engineering. This was not finance as we know it. There were not any Wall Street banks or stock tickers. This was something far more raw and direct. It was a system born not from a desire for economic growth, but from the bureaucratic need to manage the world's first large-scale economies. The temples and palaces that dominated the Mesopotamian landscape were not just religious and political centers. They were massive economic engines, and debt was the fuel that made them run. And at the heart of this system is a stunning paradox. On one hand, Mesopotamian rulers enforced brutally high, mathematically rigid interest rates that were nearly impossible for the average farmer to repay. Rates of 20% for silver and a staggering 33.3% for grain were set by the state for millennia. These were not driven by market forces. They were designed for easy calculation by bureaucrats. And they had the predictable effect of driving much of the population into a spiral of compounding debt, dependency, and even temporary servitude. But on the other hand, just when this system of extraction threatened to boil over, when society became dangerously split between a handful of creditors and a mass of indebted farmers, the king would step in and declare a clean slate. These royal proclamations, known by names like Amarji in Sumerian or Andararam in Akkadian, would cancel widespread agrarian debts, free those sold into bondage, and return foreclosed lands to their original families. So what was really going on? Was this a benevolent society that understood the dangers of debt better than we do? Or was it a far more sophisticated trap? A two-stroke engine of control, designed first to ensnare the population, and then to publicly release them in a grand display of royal power, cementing the king's ultimate authority? We are going to unravel this ancient financial machine. We will explore how debt was first invented, not by loan sharks, but by accountants. We will break down the simple, terrifying math that turned interest into a weapon. We will look at the human cost of this system. What happened when you could not pay? And finally, we will uncover the true political genius behind the clean slate, the royal reset button that kept the whole system from collapsing and, in doing so, kept the king firmly in charge. This is the hidden history of debt, and it shows that the struggle between financial control and human freedom is as old as civilization itself. To get how debt became a tool of control, you first have to erase your modern ideas about money. Forget cash and credit cards. We have to go back to Sumer, around 3000 before Common Era, to a world where the economy ran through massive, centralized institutions, the temple of the city's god and the palace of the king. These were not just buildings. They were sprawling complexes that owned most of the farmland, employed tons of people, and acted as the centers of production and redistribution for the whole society. The biggest problem for the administrators running these places was simple logistics and accounting. How do you manage handing out seeds, tools, beer, and food rations to thousands of workers? How do you track what they owe back after the harvest? The answer was not money, it was writing. Debt, in its earliest form, was not a deal between two people. It was an entry in a ledger, a bureaucratic record on a wet slab of clay. Here is how it worked. A farmer, working land owned by the temple, would be advanced seed, grain, and rations to get his family through the planting season. A scribe would meticulously record this on a cuneiform tablet. This was not a friendly loan. It was a line item in the temple's books. After the harvest, the farmer was supposed to return the principal amount of the seed, plus a share of the crop as rent for using the temple's land and equipment. In a good year, this all worked just fine. The farmer paid his dues, kept the surplus, and the cycle continued. But farming is never a sure thing. What happens when a storm flattens the crops or a drought withers the barley? The farmer could not pay. And suddenly, that administrative record of an advance transformed into something we would recognize instantly: a debt. The unpaid amount was carried over to the next year, and now, interest started to build. This is where everything changes. Interest-bearing debt seems to have come out of this institutional setting. The temples and palaces also made other things, like textiles, which were given to merchants for long-distance trade. These merchants were advanced silver and were expected to pay back the principal plus a share of the profits, which was standardized as an interest payment. It was a way for the central institution to get a predictable return on its investment. So, right from the start, Mesopotamian society had two kinds of debt. First, there was agrarian debt, centered on the local farming economy. These were the advances of barley for food and seed, owed by the cultivators, the debt of survival. Second, there was commercial debt, which fueled the world of trade. These were loans in silver, advanced to merchants to finance their ventures, the debt of opportunity. The physical act of recording these debts is what gave the system its power. A verbal promise can be forgotten, but an entry on a baked clay tablet, stamped with cylinder seals and stored in a temple archive, was permanent and undeniable. It turned a social obligation into a legally enforceable financial instrument. Writing did not just record economic activity. It created a new kind of economic reality, one where debts were quantified, tracked, and compounded over time. What began as a practical solution to a logistical problem, managing the resources of a large institution, had created something entirely new. It created a world where a farmer's bad luck in one season could turn into a permanent, mathematically growing obligation to the state. The accountants who invented this probably were not trying to create a social trap. They were just trying to balance their books. But in doing so, they forged the first link in a chain of debt that would define the lives of ordinary people for the next 3,000 years. The real genius, and the real terror, of the Mesopotamian debt system was not just the idea of interest, but the specific numbers they chose. For nearly 2,000 years, interest rates were fixed, simple, and devastatingly high. 20% per year for silver loans, and 33.3% per year for grain loans. To understand why, you have to understand how the Sumerians and Babylonians did math. Unlike our base 10 system, Mesopotamian math was sexagesimal, or base 60. We still see remnants of this today in how we measure time. 60 seconds in a minute. 60 minutes in an hour. For ancient scribes, base 60 was amazing because it is so easily divisible. You can divide 60 by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30, which made calculating fractions a breeze. And it was this simplicity that made their interest rates such an effective tool. Let us start with silver. The standard unit of weight was the mina, which was subdivided into 60 shekels. The rule for a silver loan was simple. The interest was 1 shekel per mina, per month. The basic unit fraction of their system, 1/60th, was the interest rate for a single month. A bureaucrat did not need a calculator. He just needed the rule. If you borrowed 1 mina, 60 shekels, your interest was 1 shekel a month. Over a year of 12 months, the interest on a 60 shekel loan would be 12 shekels. Now, let us translate that to our system. 12 shekels of interest on a 60 shekel principal is 12 divided by 60. That is 1/5. 1/5 is 20%. This was not an economic rate. It was a mathematical one, chosen for its elegance and ease of calculation. For over 1,000 years, from the laws of Uarnemu around 2100 before Common Era to the famous Code of Hammurabi, this 20% rate for silver stayed remarkably stable. For a merchant financing a trade expedition, this 20% rate could work. If the trip was a success, they could pay the temple its share and still keep a healthy profit. But for anyone else, it was crushing. Compounding interest meant that a loan at 20% would double in just over 3.5 years. The math itself ensured that any long-term debt was designed to grow faster than the debtor's ability to pay. Now let us look at the even higher rate for barley, 33.3%. This rate also was not random. It corresponds to the simple fraction of 1/3. Just like 20% was an easy 1/5, 33.3% was an easy 1/3 of the principal, usually due at harvest time. Part of the logic here was practical. Barley was the main food staple, but its value swung wildly through the year. A higher interest rate helped the creditor, usually the palace or temple, protect the loan's value against spoilage and price drops. But imagine you are a farmer who had a bad harvest. You owed the temple 100 bushels of barley. The next year, you owe 133. If you have another bad year, that debt keeps compounding at this explosive rate. It was a mathematical certainty that just a few bad harvests would plunge a family into a level of debt they could never escape. The laws of the time, like the Code of Hammurabi, did not question these rates. They enforced them. They legitimized a system where interest far outpaced the productive capacity of the economy. It was a state-sanctioned financial structure built on a mathematical foundation that guaranteed, over time, the flow of wealth and dependency from the countryside to the central institutions. The numbers were not just numbers, they were the engine of control. So, what happened when the relentless math of 20% or 33% interest finally caught up with an ordinary family? When a bad harvest, an illness, or a flood meant a farmer could not repay the palace. The consequences were devastating, pulling families into a downward spiral that ended in the loss of their freedom and their land. This was not just an economic transaction. It was a social catastrophe. First, the debt itself would balloon. A small loan for seed grain could, within a few years, become an impossible sum. The scribe would just add the interest to the principal on the clay tablet, and the cycle of poverty would be etched into stone. When the debt became too large to pay with grain, families had to pledge other assets. This is where the system took a terrifying turn, leading to a practice known as debt bondage. A desperate debtor could pledge himself, his wife, his son, or his daughter as collateral. They would be sent to work in the household or fields of the creditor, a palace official, a wealthy merchant, or the temple itself, to labor until the debt was paid off. Now, it is important to remember this was not quite the chattel slavery we think of from later history. In theory, it was a temporary servitude linked to a specific debt. But for the people involved, that distinction probably felt meaningless. They lost their freedom and were separated from their families. Recognizing the danger this posed, rulers like Hammurabi put limits on it. Law 117 of his famous code states that if a person has to give up a family member into service for a debt, they shall work for 3 years, and in the 4th year their freedom will be established. On the surface, this sounds enlightened. But we have to look at the king's motive. This was not really about protecting the debtor out of kindness. It was about protecting the state's assets. A person trapped in permanent bondage to a private creditor could not serve in the king's army, perform state labor, or farmland that paid taxes to the palace. By limiting the term of service, the king made sure that his most valuable resource, his population, would eventually return to his control. It was a pragmatic move to stop his own power base from being hollowed out. The other major consequence of default was losing your land. A debtor might pledge his family's ancestral land to a creditor. Over time, this often turned into an effective transfer of the land itself. For the family, this was the ultimate disaster, the loss of their livelihood and means of self-support. But this was also a disaster for the king. In Mesopotamian society, holding land came with obligations, like state labor and military service. When wealthy creditors foreclosed on dozens of small farms, they were accumulating not just property, but the labor duties that came with it. The palace was losing control of its own workforce, piece by piece, to a growing class of powerful creditors. This created a feedback loop of social polarization. The high, fixed interest rates funneled wealth upwards. A small elite grew richer, while the farmers who formed the backbone of the kingdom were systematically impoverished and dispossessed. They became tenants and servants on the very land their families had worked for generations. The kingdom was becoming dangerously unbalanced, a powerful creditor class on one side, and a growing mass of landless, desperate people on the other. This was a recipe for social collapse. The very system designed to manage the kingdom was now threatening to tear it apart. Something had to give, and the kings of Mesopotamia knew it. So we have a system mathematically designed to create inescapable debt, and a society teetering on the brink of collapse because of it. It seems completely unsustainable. But the rulers of Mesopotamia had a trick up their sleeve, a societal pressure release valve that was as brilliant as it was self-serving. Before we get to how they pulled off this incredible reset, if this hidden history of finance is blowing your mind as much as it does mine, consider subscribing and hitting that notification bell. We go deep like this every week, and you will not want to miss what is next. Okay, so how do you save a kingdom from a debt crisis you basically created? Just when the system of engineered debt reached its breaking point, the Mesopotamian king would step in with the most dramatic tool in his political kit, the Clean Slate Proclamation. These were not minor reforms. They were sweeping, top-down royal edicts that canceled huge categories of debt across the kingdom, hitting a giant reset button on the economy. These proclamations had several names. In early Sumerian records from around 2400 before Common Era, they were called amarji. The word literally means return to the mother, a beautiful phrase that meant debt servants were free to return to their families. Later, in the Akkadian language of Babylon, the edicts were known as Mishuram, justice, or Andararam, freedom. The names framed the act not as an economic policy, but as a great deed of royal justice, restoring the proper order of the world. But why would a king, the ultimate head of the creditor institutions, willingly forgive the debts owed to him? The answer is pure political pragmatism and self-preservation. The king was not destroying the system. He was saving it from its own worst tendencies to maintain his control. There were a few key motives, all serving the state. First was the need to restore the military and labor base. A kingdom full of debt servants working for private creditors has no one left to fight its wars. By declaring an Andararam, the king instantly freed thousands of citizens, making them available again for the army and for state labor projects. Second, the Clean Slate was about reclaiming control over the land and its output. When creditors foreclosed on farms, the state lost that tax revenue. The proclamations reversed these foreclosures, returning land to its original cultivators. This did not just help the farmers. It reestablished the direct economic link between the people and the palace, cutting out the middlemen who were siphoning off the kingdom's wealth. Third, these edicts were a powerful public relations tool to prevent social unrest. A large, landless, and angry population is a powder keg. By wiping the slate clean, the king could defuse that anger. It was a spectacular move that reinforced his divine image as the shepherd of his people, the protector of the weak. The proclamation was often celebrated with a ceremony where the king would raise a golden torch, signaling the start of a new, just order, a public display of ultimate power. Crucially, these proclamations were very targeted. They were not a blanket amnesty for all debt. The debts that were canceled were almost exclusively agrarian debts, the barley debts owed by farmers to the state or state officials. These were the non-commercial debts with the most destabilizing social effects. What was not canceled? Commercial debts. The silver loans between merchants were left intact. Rulers knew they needed to preserve the commercial engine of the economy. They canceled the debts that threatened their political control while protecting the debts that generated wealth. We have detailed records of these events. Historians have identified around 30 such proclamations between 2400 and 1400 before Common Era, often issued when a new king took the throne. One of the most famous is the Edict of Amisaduqa, a Babylonian king who ruled around 1645 before Common Era. His edict goes into painstaking detail, specifying exactly which debts are canceled and even prescribing the death penalty for creditors who refuse to comply. It shows a highly sophisticated machine designed to periodically rebalance the entire system. The Clean Slate was the masterstroke of Mesopotamian political economy. It was a predictable mechanism that allowed the state to have it both ways. It could benefit from a system of high-interest debt extraction. And then, when that system reached a crisis point, it could heroically intervene, reinforcing its own power and legitimacy in the process. When you put all the pieces together, the bureaucratic origins of debt, the punishing math, the human cost, and the political theater of the Clean Slate, a clear and stunning picture emerges. Ancient Mesopotamian debt was not just an economic feature. It was a deliberately engineered system of cyclical dependency and control. It was a technology of power as important as their irrigation canals or cuneiform script. Think of it as a great two-stroke engine powering the state. Stroke 1 is ensnarement. This is the slow, quiet, bureaucratic phase. Through fixed, high-interest rates, the system was mathematically designed to pull most of the farming population into debt to the central institutions. A single bad harvest could trigger a debt that would become impossible to repay. This process slowly siphoned economic power from the countryside to the center. It created a dependent population legally bound to the palace and temple. This was not done with soldiers, but with the quiet entries of scribes on clay tablets. It was controlled by accounting. Stroke 2 is release and reassertion. This is the loud, spectacular, political phase. When the pressure from Stroke 1 became too great, when too many people had lost their land and freedom, the king would hit the reset button. By canceling agrarian debts, the Anderarm acted as a pressure release valve. But it did more than that. It powerfully reasserted the king's ultimate authority. It showed that while private creditors might gain temporary power, only the king held the power of ultimate forgiveness. It made the king the hero, the restorer of justice. The people were not freed by a revolution from below. They were freed by a decree from above, making them grateful subjects, ready for the cycle to begin all over again. This cyclical model of ensnare and release was far more sophisticated than simple taxation. A tax just takes a slice of the pie. This system controlled the whole bakery. It managed the entire economic life cycle of its subjects. By first encouraging the accumulation of debt, the state created a problem that only it could solve. It weakened potential rival power bases, like wealthy creditors, by periodically wiping out their assets. It ensured the state's access to its two most critical resources, the labor of its people and the produce of the land. This system prioritized long-term stability over short-term profit. The rulers of Sumer and Babylonia recognized a fundamental truth that many later societies would forget. A system that lets debt pile up forever will eventually destroy itself. Their solution, the clean slate, was not born of mercy, but of a clear-eyed understanding of power. They understood that true control did not come from squeezing every last shekel out of the populace. It came from managing the flow of debt and dependency, knowing when to tighten the screw and, crucially, knowing when to loosen it to ensure the whole machine could keep running for centuries. The story of Mesopotamian debt is the story of a civilization that invented one of the most powerful social technologies in human history. They created a system that balanced the relentless extraction of wealth with the pragmatic need for social stability. It was a two-part machine, brutally high interest rates that guaranteed mass indebtedness, coupled with a royal reset button that periodically wiped the slate clean, preventing collapse and reasserting the king's power. It was not a system of benevolence, but a remarkable, and often brutal, system of control. When we look from the dusty clay tablets of Babylon to the glowing screens of our own time, the echoes are uncanny. We have, without a doubt, inherited and perfected the first half of the Mesopotamian engine. High compounding interest is the bedrock of our modern financial world. Credit card debt, with interest rates often over 20%, functions as a powerful trap for millions, eerily mirroring the 20% silver loans of the ancient world. Student loans and other personal debts create cycles of dependency that can feel just as inescapable as those faced by a Sumerian farmer. We see the same outcomes: growing wealth polarization and a sense of being trapped in a system that benefits creditors. But we are missing the second half of the machine. Where's our clean slate? Where is our emargy, our return to the mother? Modern societies have things like bankruptcy, but these are personal, often shameful ordeals that signal individual failure, not a systemic reset. We do not have routine, society-wide debt jubilees proclaimed by our leaders to restore economic balance. The very idea is often dismissed as radical. Instead, our system prioritizes the sanctity of the debt contract above almost all else. When our system reaches a crisis, as it did in 2008, the intervention is typically aimed at saving the creditor institutions, not forgiving the debts of the people. This forces us to ask a difficult question. Was the ancient Mesopotamian system, with its cynical but cyclical forgiveness, in some ways more stable and more aware of the destructive power of debt than our own? Those ancient kings, motivated by pure self-interest, understood that an economy cannot survive when its population is buried under an impossible mountain of debt. They engineered a release valve to prevent the whole system from exploding. We live in a world with only the engine of ensnarement running at full throttle, with no emergency stop in sight. Perhaps the greatest lesson from the clay tablets of Mesopotamia is not just about how an ancient society used debt to control its people, but a warning about what happens when a society forgets how and why to forgive it.